the most dangerous road to tyranny is paved with good intentions. Throughout my decades of studying economic systems and their political consequences, I've observed a disturbing pattern. Every attempt to expand government control over economic life inevitably expands government control over personal life. This isn't a matter of ideology, it's a matter of logical necessity and practical impossibility. When we grant government the power to direct economic activity, we surrender the very mechanisms that protect our individual freedom. The knowledge required for central planning doesn't exist in any single mind or institution. Yet the attempt to gather such knowledge requires unprecedented surveillance and control over citizens' choices. Today, as Americans debate healthcare mandates, financial regulations, and industrial policy, you're witnessing the same fundamental trade-off I warned about decades ago. The choice isn't between more or less government efficiency, it's between preserving the spontaneous order that protects liberty or accepting the comprehensive planning that destroys it. Chapter 1: The Logical Impossibility of Democratic Planning. The seductive promise of democratic socialism, that we can somehow plan the economy while preserving political freedom, represents perhaps the most dangerous intellectual error of our time. During my years at the London School of Economics, I witnessed firsthand how well-meaning intellectuals convinced themselves that central planning could be both efficient and democratic. They failed to grasp a fundamental logical problem. Economic planning requires decisions about every aspect of production and distribution, decisions that cannot be made democratically without paralyzing the entire system. Consider what comprehensive planning actually demands. Every resource allocation, every production target, every price level must be consciously decided by someone with authority. But in a democracy, how do you vote on whether steel should go to automobiles or refrigerators? How do you democratically determine the optimal production mix of thousands of products? The complexity is staggering. Millions of interdependent decisions that market prices coordinate automatically must somehow be made through political processes. The arithmetic alone is overwhelming. A central planning board would need to process information about consumer preferences, resource availabilities, technological possibilities, and changing conditions across millions of products and services. No democratic assembly could possibly debate and vote on such detailed questions. The sheer volume would require years to decide what markets determine in minutes through price signals. This impossibility forces planners toward two solutions, both fatal to democracy. First, they delegate detailed decisions to technical experts, removing economic choices from democratic control. Citizens vote for broad goals, but unelected bureaucrats determine how resources actually get allocated. Second, they simplify the decision-making process by reducing choices, fewer products, standardized services, and controlled consumption patterns that can be managed centrally. Both paths lead away from democratic accountability. When experts make the real decisions, voters lose influence over the policies that affect their daily lives. When choices are artificially simplified, the planning authority must decide which preferences matter and which don't. In either case, the promise of democratic planning proves illusory. The deeper problem lies in the nature of democratic decision-making itself. Successful democracy requires limited scope for collective decisions, areas where citizens can meaningfully evaluate options and hold representatives accountable. When government attempts to plan economic life, it necessarily expands the scope of collective decision-making beyond what democratic processes can handle effectively. The result isn't democratic planning but the gradual erosion of democracy through bureaucratic necessity. This logical impossibility explains why every attempt at comprehensive planning, however democratic its intentions, eventually concentrates power in the hands of technical experts and planning bureaucrats who operate beyond meaningful democratic control. Chapter 2: From Economic Control to Total Control. The progression from economic planning to political tyranny follows an inexorable logic that even the most democratic intentions cannot escape. When government assumes responsibility for directing economic life, it must acquire the tools necessary for that task, tools that inevitably become instruments of comprehensive social control. This isn't a matter of evil intentions or political ambition, but of functional necessity. Economic planning requires detailed knowledge about resource availability, production capabilities, and consumer preferences. But in a complex economy, this information doesn't exist in readily accessible form. It must be gathered, and gathering it requires extensive surveillance of business operations, individual consumption patterns, and personal preferences. The planning authority must know not just what people currently buy, but what they might want to buy under different circumstances. This surveillance naturally expands beyond purely economic matters. To plan production effectively, authorities need to understand demographic trends, educational patterns, regional preferences, and social movements that might affect future demand. They must monitor not just business transactions but the underlying social and cultural factors that drive economic behavior. The boundary between economic and social surveillance dissolves under the pressure of planning requirements. Control follows surveillance with equal inevitability. Knowledge without the power to act on it serves no planning purpose. If the plan calls for increased steel production, the planning authority must ensure that workers actually go to steel plants rather than other industries they might prefer. If the plan requires certain consumption patterns, authorities must have mechanisms to direct purchases toward planned goods and away from unplanned alternatives. These mechanisms start as economic incentives but evolve into legal mandates as their inadequacy becomes apparent. When incentives fail to produce planned results, planners face a choice: abandon the plan or enforce compliance. The logic of planning demands enforcement. Citizens' job choices, consumption decisions, and investment patterns must conform to the plan's requirements, not their personal preferences. The enforcement apparatus necessary for economic control naturally extends to political and social control. Workers who resist job assignments aren't just economic problems, they're threats to the plan's success. Critics who question planning decisions aren't just political opponents, they're undermining the technical expertise necessary for effective coordination. Independent organizations that operate outside the plan's framework aren't just alternative institutions, they're competing sources of authority that confuse the chain of command. Consider how this dynamic played out in every planned economy. The Soviet Union didn't begin with gulags and secret police, it began with workers' councils and democratic planning committees. But the practical requirements of coordinating a complex economy demanded ever more comprehensive control over individual choices. Each new economic problem required new powers for planners, new restrictions on individual freedom, and new mechanisms for enforcement. The same logic operates in democratic societies that attempt partial planning. Regulatory agencies acquire broader powers to gather information about business operations. Planning authorities demand greater control over investment decisions, employment practices, and market outcomes. Each expansion of economic control requires corresponding expansions of political authority, surveillance capabilities, and enforcement mechanisms. The tragedy is that this progression appears gradual and reasonable at each step. Each new power seems justified by the technical requirements of effective planning. But the cumulative effect transforms the entire character of government from a protector of individual rights to a director of individual choices. Chapter 3: The Knowledge Problem: Why Planners Must Become Dictators. The fundamental challenge facing any central planner isn't administrative complexity or political resistance, it's the impossibility of acquiring the knowledge necessary for effective coordination. This knowledge problem forces even well-intentioned planners toward increasingly authoritarian methods, not through moral failure but through logical necessity. The knowledge required for economic coordination exists in a dispersed form that no central authority can possibly consolidate. Each individual possesses unique information about their circumstances, preferences, and opportunities, information that changes constantly and often can't be articulated clearly even by those who possess it. A farmer knows the condition of his soil, a worker understands her capabilities, an entrepreneur recognizes market opportunities that others miss. This local, contextual knowledge forms the foundation of all economic activity. Market prices coordinate this dispersed knowledge automatically, allowing individuals to respond to information they don't consciously possess. When coffee becomes scarce in Brazil, rising prices signal consumers worldwide to economize without anyone needing to understand the specific circumstances causing the shortage. The price system transforms local knowledge into global coordination without requiring any central authority to gather and process the underlying information. Central planners, lacking access to this dispersed knowledge, must find alternative methods for coordinating economic activity. They commission studies, conduct surveys, and analyze statistics, but these methods capture only a fraction of the relevant information and always lag behind changing conditions. The dynamic, contextual knowledge that drives market coordination remains beyond their reach. This knowledge deficit forces planners toward increasingly detailed control over individual decisions. Unable to coordinate through price signals, they must coordinate through direct commands. But effective commands require detailed knowledge about the circumstances being commanded. If planners don't understand why individuals make particular choices, they can't design commands that produce better outcomes. The search for this knowledge drives planners toward ever more comprehensive surveillance and reporting requirements. Businesses must disclose their operations in minute detail. Individuals must report their activities, preferences, and future plans. The planning authority requires not just statistical aggregates but detailed information about specific circumstances, capabilities, and intentions. Yet even perfect surveillance wouldn't solve the knowledge problem, because much of the relevant knowledge doesn't exist until the moment of action. Entrepreneurial insights, creative solutions, and adaptive responses emerge through the process of market interaction itself. They can't be predicted, surveyed, or commanded into existence by planning authorities. This impossibility forces planners into a cruel dilemma. They can acknowledge their ignorance and abandon comprehensive planning, or they can proceed despite their ignorance and hope that central commands somehow produce better results than decentralized choices. The logic of planning demands the second option, even though it guarantees inferior outcomes. The authoritarian implications are inevitable. When commands based on incomplete knowledge produce poor results, planners must choose between admitting failure or blaming resistance to their authority. The logic of planning points toward the second explanation. If the plan isn't working, it must be because people aren't following it properly. If people aren't following it properly, enforcement must be inadequate. This reasoning transforms political opponents into enemies of rational planning and economic progress. Citizens who resist commands aren't just expressing preferences, they're demonstrating ignorance or selfishness that undermines collective welfare. Their resistance justifies stronger enforcement, broader surveillance, and more comprehensive control over their choices. The knowledge problem thus drives even democratic planners toward authoritarian solutions. Unable to coordinate through market mechanisms, lacking the knowledge necessary for effective commands, they must choose between abandoning planning or expanding their control over the individuals whose knowledge they need but cannot obtain. Chapter 4: The Fatal Conceit of Rational Administration. The belief that rational administration can replace spontaneous market coordination represents what I've termed the fatal conceit, the assumption that human reason can design better institutions than those that emerge through evolutionary processes. This conceit drives the expansion of governmental power by convincing well-meaning officials that they can improve upon the chaos of market outcomes through systematic planning and regulation. The conceit appears reasonable because market outcomes often seem inefficient or unfair to casual observation. Why should resources flow to luxury goods when basic needs remain unmet? Why should some individuals earn vastly more than others? Why should useful businesses fail while wasteful ones succeed? The market's coordination appears arbitrary, even irrational, to those who don't understand its underlying logic. Rational administration promises to correct these apparent irrationalities through conscious design and systematic oversight. Expert administrators, armed with data and analytical tools, claim they can direct resources more efficiently than blind market forces. They promise to eliminate waste, reduce inequality, and ensure that social resources serve genuine human needs rather than arbitrary market demands. This promise rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what market coordination actually accomplishes. Markets don't allocate resources according to abstract notions of efficiency or fairness. They coordinate the diverse plans and preferences of millions of individuals through a discovery process that no central authority could replicate. The apparent irrationalities of market outcomes often reflect information and trade-offs that aren't visible to outside observers. When government attempts to improve upon market outcomes through rational administration, it necessarily substitutes the judgment of planners for the distributed intelligence of market participants. This substitution seems reasonable when planners appear more informed or rational than typical market actors. But the comparison is misleading because it contrasts the planner's theoretical knowledge with individual actors' practical knowledge, ignoring the coordinating function that emerges from market interaction. The fatal conceit manifests in regulatory agencies that claim expertise superior to market participants, social programs that promise to distribute resources more fairly than market outcomes, and industrial policies that aim to direct investment more wisely than private entrepreneurs. Each intervention appears justified by the administrator's superior rationality compared to the irrational outcomes they're replacing. But rational administration faces an insurmountable obstacle, the knowledge problem I've discussed extensively. Administrators can gather statistical data and conduct scientific studies, but they cannot access the tacit, contextual knowledge that drives market coordination. Their rational calculations, however sophisticated, must operate with incomplete information about the very circumstances they're trying to improve. This knowledge deficit forces administrators to make decisions based on simplified models that ignore crucial details. They must assume away the complexities that market coordination handles automatically. Their rational plans inevitably produce unintended consequences because they cannot anticipate all the adjustments that their interventions will trigger throughout the economic system. When these unintended consequences emerge, the logic of rational administration demands further intervention to correct the problems created by previous interventions. Each new problem provides evidence that administrative control is inadequate, justifying expanded authority and more comprehensive planning. The system becomes increasingly complex and unwieldy as administrators attempt to manage all the interdependencies their previous interventions have disrupted. The progression toward comprehensive control follows naturally from the administrator's rational confidence in their superior expertise. If they can improve upon market outcomes in one area, why not others? If their interventions produce problems, those problems must result from inadequate administrative authority rather than fundamental limitations of central planning. The solution is always more administration, broader authority, and deeper intervention into market processes. Citizens begin as beneficiaries of rational administration but gradually become obstacles to its effective operation. Their preferences, choices, and resistance to administrative directives represent irrationalities that prevent optimal outcomes. The logic of rational administration increasingly views individual freedom as an impediment to collective welfare, justifying ever more comprehensive control over personal choices in the name of rational social organization. Chapter 5: How Emergency Powers Become Permanent Powers. The expansion of governmental power often accelerates during crises, when normal democratic constraints appear inadequate to address urgent problems. Emergency powers granted temporarily for specific crises have a disturbing tendency to become permanent features of government authority, fundamentally altering the relationship between state and citizen long after the original emergency has passed. This dynamic reveals a crucial vulnerability in democratic systems: the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine emergencies that require extraordinary measures and normal problems that political leaders choose to characterize as emergencies. Once government acquires emergency powers, it develops both the capability and the incentive to discover new emergencies that justify retaining those powers. Consider how economic crises typically expand governmental authority. When markets experience disruption, whether through financial panic, resource shortages, or technological displacement, political pressure builds for immediate government intervention. Normal market adjustments seem too slow, too uncertain, or too painful for democratic patience. Citizens demand action, and politicians respond by claiming emergency authority to override market mechanisms and direct economic activity according to political priorities. These emergency interventions begin with broad public support because they promise to solve urgent problems that markets appear unable to address. Wartime production controls, Depression-era financial regulations, and crisis-driven industrial policies all emerged from genuine emergencies that seemed to require extraordinary governmental action. The interventions appeared temporary, targeted, and clearly justified by exceptional circumstances. But emergency powers create new institutional interests that resist their own elimination. Government agencies established to manage crises develop permanent staff, established procedures, and political constituencies that benefit from continued intervention. The expertise acquired for crisis management becomes a resource that agencies are reluctant to abandon when the crisis passes. More fundamentally, emergency interventions alter the baseline expectations about governmental responsibility. Once government accepts responsibility for preventing economic crises, maintaining employment levels, or ensuring particular social outcomes, it cannot easily retreat from those responsibilities without appearing to abandon its citizens. The emergency becomes normalized as a permanent governmental function. The knowledge problem operates here with particular force. Emergency interventions typically succeed in addressing the most visible symptoms of crises: unemployment falls, production increases, financial markets stabilize. But the long-term adjustments that market processes would have generated never occur, creating hidden distortions that eventually manifest as new crises requiring additional interventions. Each successive crisis appears to confirm the necessity of governmental authority rather than revealing the consequences of previous interventions. The Austrian theory of business cycles, which I helped develop, demonstrates how government intervention in credit markets creates the very instabilities that then justify further intervention. But this causal relationship remains invisible to most observers, who see only the immediate crisis and the government's response. The political incentives strongly favor expanding emergency powers rather than questioning their necessity. Politicians gain credit for decisive action during crises but rarely face accountability for the long-term consequences of their interventions. The benefits of emergency action are immediate and visible, while the costs are diffused and delayed. Democratic processes favor politicians who promise quick solutions over those who counsel patience for market adjustments. Constitutional constraints designed to limit emergency powers prove inadequate against the combination of genuine public pressure and political ambition. Courts defer to executive authority during crises. Legislatures feel compelled to grant whatever powers administrators claim to need, and constitutional principles bend under the weight of urgent necessity. The rule of law yields to the logic of administrative efficiency. This process accelerates when emergencies become routine rather than exceptional. Modern governments face constant pressure to respond to economic fluctuations, social problems, and technological changes as if they were emergencies requiring immediate intervention. The distinction between normal governance and emergency response dissolves, leaving government with permanent emergency powers that operate without the traditional constraints of democratic accountability. The result is a fundamental transformation in the nature of governmental authority. What begins as temporary deviation from normal constitutional processes becomes the new normal, with expanded powers, broader bureaucratic discretion, and reduced citizen influence over policy decisions. Democracy adapts to emergency government rather than emergency government yielding to democratic restoration. Chapter 6: The Bureaucratic State versus Constitutional Liberty. The growth of the bureaucratic state represents perhaps the greatest threat to constitutional liberty in modern democratic societies. This threat operates not through dramatic constitutional crises but through the gradual displacement of constitutional governance by administrative rulemaking that operates beyond effective democratic control or judicial oversight. Constitutional government rests on the principle that political power must be limited, predictable, and accountable to citizens through established legal processes. The Constitution doesn't just allocate power among different branches of government, it constrains how that power can be exercised by requiring specific procedures, protecting individual rights, and maintaining the rule of law through general, prospective rules rather than arbitrary commands. The bureaucratic state undermines these constitutional principles through the practical necessities of administrative governance. Modern regulatory agencies combine legislative, executive, and judicial functions in ways that would be clearly unconstitutional if performed by traditional government branches. They write rules that have the force of law, enforce those rules through administrative procedures, and adjudicate disputes about their application through internal processes that lack traditional legal protections. This concentration of functions appears necessary for effective administration of complex modern problems. Environmental protection, financial regulation, and social welfare programs seem to require technical expertise and administrative flexibility that traditional constitutional processes cannot provide. But the practical benefits of administrative efficiency come at the cost of constitutional protections that limit governmental power. The knowledge problem operates here in a particularly insidious way. Bureaucratic agencies claim superior expertise in their specialized domains, justifying their independence from normal political oversight and constitutional constraints. But this expertise is necessarily limited to technical matters that can be studied scientifically, while the broader questions of values, priorities, and trade-offs that drive policy decisions require the democratic deliberation that bureaucratic processes exclude. Administrative law attempts to reconcile bureaucratic necessity with constitutional principles by requiring agencies to follow prescribed procedures, provide public notice of proposed rules, and accept public comments before implementation. But these procedural requirements cannot substitute for the substantive constraints that constitutional governance imposes on political power. The fundamental problem lies in the different logic that drives constitutional governance versus administrative governance. Constitutional processes assume that governmental power is dangerous and must be carefully constrained, while administrative processes assume that governmental expertise is beneficial and should be efficiently deployed. These assumptions lead to different institutional designs, different accountability mechanisms, and different relationships between government and citizens. Under constitutional governance, citizens possess rights that government cannot violate regardless of administrative convenience or expert judgment. Under administrative governance, citizens possess interests that agencies must balance against other considerations according to professional expertise and bureaucratic procedures. The shift from rights to interests fundamentally alters the citizen's relationship to governmental power. This transformation occurs gradually through the accumulation of administrative precedents, regulatory interpretations, and bureaucratic procedures that acquire the force of law without explicit constitutional authorization. Citizens discover that their property rights, business activities, and personal choices are subject to administrative oversight that operates according to bureaucratic logic rather than constitutional constraints. The democratic process provides inadequate protection against this administrative expansion because bureaucratic agencies typically enjoy strong political support from the constituencies they serve. Environmental agencies attract support from environmental groups, labor agencies from unions, business agencies from regulated industries. These concentrated interests have stronger incentives to monitor and influence agency actions than the general public has to resist bureaucratic expansion. Congressional oversight proves similarly inadequate because legislators lack the technical expertise necessary to evaluate complex regulatory decisions, and they face political pressure to defer to agency expertise rather than challenge popular programs. The expertise gap between legislators and administrators tilts the balance of power toward bureaucratic independence rather than democratic accountability. Judicial review, the traditional constitutional check on governmental overreach, proves insufficient because courts typically defer to agency expertise on technical matters while focusing on procedural compliance rather than substantive limitations on administrative authority. The complexity of modern regulation makes meaningful judicial oversight practically impossible in most cases. The result is a form of governance that operates according to administrative logic rather than constitutional principles, where expert judgment replaces democratic deliberation and bureaucratic efficiency trumps individual rights. This transformation may improve governmental effectiveness in addressing complex social problems, but it fundamentally alters the nature of democratic governance and the relationship between citizen and state. Chapter 7: Protecting Freedom in the Age of Big Government. The challenge facing lovers of liberty today isn't simply to oppose governmental expansion but to develop institutional mechanisms that can preserve freedom within the realities of modern democratic societies. This requires understanding how spontaneous order principles can operate even when government has acquired extensive responsibilities that earlier generations would have considered beyond its proper scope. The key insight from spontaneous order theory is that freedom doesn't require minimal government but rather government that operates according to general rules rather than specific commands. The distinction between law and legislation becomes crucial here. Genuine law consists of abstract principles that apply equally to all citizens, while legislation consists of specific directives that government issues to achieve particular outcomes. Constitutional liberty survives when government confines itself to maintaining the framework within which spontaneous order can operate. This includes protecting property rights, enforcing contracts, preventing fraud, and maintaining competitive markets. But it excludes directing how individuals should use their property, what contracts they should make, or what market outcomes they should achieve. Modern welfare states need not destroy freedom if they operate through general rules rather than specific commands. A universal basic income that provides all citizens with identical support differs fundamentally from targeted programs that grant bureaucratic agencies discretion over who receives what benefits under what conditions. The first preserves individual choice while providing social security, the second substitutes administrative judgment for personal decision-making. The same principle applies to regulation of business activity. Rules that prohibit specific harmful behaviors, fraud, pollution, safety violations, differ fundamentally from regulations that direct how businesses should operate to achieve administratively determined social goals. The first maintains competitive markets while protecting against genuine harms, the second substitutes bureaucratic planning for market coordination. The cryptocurrency revolution demonstrates how technological innovation can restore spontaneous order even within heavily regulated economic systems. Digital currencies, decentralized finance, and blockchain-based contracts create new mechanisms for voluntary cooperation that operate independently of traditional banking and regulatory systems. These innovations don't eliminate government but provide alternatives that limit its practical control over economic activity. Similarly, The digital economy enables new forms of spontaneous organization that bypass traditional institutional bottlenecks. Remote work reduces geographical monopolies. Online education challenges educational bureaucracies, and digital platforms enable direct exchange between producers and consumers without intermediary control. Technology restores individual choice in areas where bureaucratic institutions previously dominated. The restoration of constitutional liberty requires political strategies that work with rather than against the grain of democratic politics. This means supporting reforms that reduce bureaucratic discretion while maintaining popular programs, that restore competitive markets while addressing legitimate social concerns, and that protect individual rights while acknowledging collective responsibilities. Federalism provides a crucial mechanism for preserving freedom within democratic societies by allowing different jurisdictions to experiment with different approaches to common problems. When state and local governments compete for residents and businesses, they face market-like pressures to provide effective services without oppressive restrictions. This competitive federalism can restore spontaneous order principles even when national politics favor comprehensive planning. Educational choice represents another promising avenue for reducing bureaucratic control while maintaining public support for education. School vouchers, charter schools, and educational savings accounts introduce market mechanisms into public education without eliminating public responsibility for ensuring educational opportunity. These reforms demonstrate how spontaneous order principles can operate within existing political frameworks. The most important protection for freedom lies in maintaining the intellectual and cultural foundations that make liberty possible. This requires understanding why spontaneous order produces better outcomes than central planning, why individual rights deserve protection even when they conflict with collective goals, and why constitutional constraints on governmental power serve the long-term interests of democratic societies. The battle for freedom today isn't fought primarily in legislatures or courts but in universities, media, and the broader culture where ideas about the proper relationship between individual and state are formed and transmitted. The spontaneous order that protects liberty emerges from widespread understanding of its principles, not from political victories that lack cultural support. This intellectual foundation provides the only reliable protection against the recurring temptation to expand governmental power in response to social problems, economic crises, and technological changes. When citizens understand why freedom works and why central planning fails, they can resist the fatal conceit that human reason can design better institutions than those that emerge through voluntary cooperation and competitive selection. Conclusion. The path from big government to big brother isn't a slippery slope, it's a logical necessity driven by the knowledge problem, administrative requirements, and political incentives that operate whenever government attempts comprehensive social planning. Understanding this progression isn't about political pessimism but about intellectual honesty regarding the constraints that reality imposes on human ambition. The good news is that spontaneous order provides robust alternatives to central planning. Alternatives that can preserve freedom even within modern democratic welfare states if we design institutions according to sound principles rather than utopian aspirations. The choice isn't between perfect freedom and perfect security, but between systems that preserve the knowledge, incentives, and institutional evolution that make both freedom and prosperity possible. Your generation inherits both the greatest threat to liberty in human history and the greatest tools for preserving it. The outcome depends on whether you choose the humble wisdom of spontaneous order or the fatal conceit of rational planning.